Some people think HOA rules are the highest law in the neighborhood. What happened on a quiet Tuesday morning proved that assumption can get very expensive very fast. The metallic snap of bolt cutters cut through the still air of Willowbrook Estates at exactly 6:47 a.m., sharp and clean like someone breaking a thick branch in half, and I heard it before I even stepped onto the porch. The early Texas sun had just started pushing over the rooftops, turning the row of identical beige houses into long shadows across the cul-de-sac, and the smell of fresh mulch from someone's landscaping drifted lazily through the warm air. Then came the second sound, the dull clank of a heavy chain falling against steel. I didn't need to look to know what that was, but I looked anyway. Standing in my driveway, wearing a pressed white tennis outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, was Bethany Kensington Wright, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, holding a pair of bright orange bolt cutters like she was trimming rose bushes. At her feet lay the thick security chain that had been wrapped around the front axle of my Jeep Wrangler the night before, or what used to be wrapped around it. The chain now lay open on the concrete like a defeated snake. A white tow truck idled quietly at the curb, diesel rumbling low and steady, its amber lights flashing slow pulses across the morning pavement. Bethany glanced down at the broken lock with a satisfied little nod, then turned toward the driver and waved him forward with the casual confidence of someone who believed she ran the entire neighborhood. "Go ahead," she called, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This vehicle is in violation of community standards." The tow truck driver hesitated, one hand resting on the gear shift, clearly unsure about towing a vehicle out of someone else's driveway at sunrise. Bethany didn't hesitate at all. She stepped closer to the Jeep, planting one manicured hand on the hood like she was claiming new territory. "I already sent 3 violation notices," she continued, loud enough for half the street to hear. "And if the owner refuses to cooperate, the HOA is authorized to remove the nuisance." Nuisance. That word hung in the air for a moment while the diesel engine idled and the tow cable rattled softly against the truck bed. My Jeep sat exactly where it had been the night before, dusty from a long week of work, government-issue tires still carrying a thin coat of West Texas dirt. The windshield reflected the morning sun, hiding the equipment mounted just behind the dashboard. From the street, it looked like any other Jeep, maybe a little older, maybe a little rough around the edges, but nothing that should have caused this kind of drama. Bethany clearly believed otherwise. She tapped the hood twice with her fingernails, producing a hollow metallic sound. "These military-style vehicles ruin property values," she announced, as if she were delivering a speech at City Hall. Across the street, someone's garage door creaked open. A neighbor stepped out with a coffee mug and stopped mid-sip, watching the scene unfold with the quiet curiosity that always follows HOA drama. Another curtain shifted in a nearby window. The neighborhood was waking up. Bethany smiled when she noticed the audience forming. She loved audiences. "Rules exist for a reason," she continued, straightening her shoulders, her perfume drifting faintly across the driveway. "And this one has been ignored long enough." That's when I stepped outside. The gravel at the edge of the driveway crunched under my boots, a small sound, but loud enough to make the tow truck driver glance over immediately. Bethany turned a second later, her smile tightening when she realized the owner of the Jeep had finally appeared. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. The chain lay broken on the concrete between us. The tow truck engine hummed. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler system hissed to life. Bethany recovered first, crossing her arms with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the rules are always on your side. "Good morning," she said, voice dripping with polite authority. "You must be the owner." I looked down at the cut chain, then at the bolt cutters still hanging loosely in her hand. "Something like that," I said calmly. She gestured toward the Jeep like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Your vehicle is being removed for violating HOA regulations." She paused just long enough to enjoy the moment. What she didn't know, what absolutely no one on this quiet suburban street knew yet, was that the Jeep sitting in my driveway didn't technically belong to me at all. And cutting that lock? That wasn't just an HOA issue. It was the kind of mistake that tends to bring federal paperwork into a neighborhood very quickly. I watched Bethany for another second before answering, because people like her always expect an argument, a raised voice, maybe even a little panic. What they rarely expect is calm. The tow truck idled behind her, diesel humming softly in the warm morning air, while the amber lights continued to flash slow circles across the pavement. I stepped down the last porch stair and walked toward the Jeep, the smell of cut grass drifting from somewhere down the street. Up close, the broken lock lay in two clean pieces on the concrete. Bethany had not even tried to hide what she had done. The bright orange bolt cutters were still hanging loosely from her right hand, like some kind of trophy. She followed my eyes and lifted her chin slightly. "The community has standards," she said, her voice carrying that rehearsed patience people use when they believe they are educating someone beneath them. I bent down and picked up the cut chain, letting the steel links slide slowly through my fingers. It had been a good lock too, quarter-inch hardened steel, the kind most people would think twice about attacking with garden tools. Apparently Bethany Kensington, right, was not most people. "You cut my lock?" I said quietly. She gave a short, dismissive shrug. "The HOA has authority to remove violations when residents refuse to comply with written notice." The tow truck driver cleared his throat behind her, but did not move. He was watching the exchange the way people watch thunderstorms roll in from a distance, curious but cautious. I set the broken chain on the Jeep's front bumper and rested one hand on the hood. The metal was still cool from the night air. "How many notices did you say you sent?" I asked. Bethany's smile returned, thin and satisfied. 3 formal violations and 1 courtesy reminder. All properly documented. She gestured toward the Jeep again. Unauthorized vehicle type. Commercial equipment storage. Visual disruption to neighborhood appearance. The list sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced saying it in front of a mirror. I nodded slowly as if considering it. In truth, I had heard variations of that same speech for the last 2 months. "My name is Daniel Carter. I moved into this house 8 weeks ago. After inheriting it from my grandmother, Rose Carter, who had lived on this street since 1989, back when Willowbrook Estates was still surrounded by open pasture instead of rows of matching fences and mailbox posts. Growing up, I spent every summer here learning how to fix lawn mowers in her garage and listening to her complain about city traffic that was still 20 miles away. When she passed last winter, the house came to me along with a stack of paperwork that included property tax receipts, insurance documents, and a thick binder labeled HOA covenants that looked like it had been written during the Cold War. I work for a regional narcotics task force that coordinates with local and federal agencies across 3 states. Most weeks I am not home long enough to notice what color the neighbors paint their mailboxes. The Jeep sitting in my driveway is assigned to our unit for field work and transportation. It carries equipment that costs more than every car parked on this street combined. Although from the outside it just looks like an older Wrangler with dusty tires and a few government decals. Bethany did not care about any of that. From the moment I parked it here, she treated that Jeep like a personal insult. The first violation notice arrived exactly 4 days after I moved in. The second one followed a week later. By the time the third envelope showed up in my mailbox, complete with bold red lettering and the HOA letterhead printed across the top, I had a feeling the situation was going to end exactly like this morning. What Bethany believed was that she was enforcing neighborhood standards. What she did not understand was that the Jeep she had just ordered to be towed was not simply a resident's vehicle. And cutting that chain had just turned a quiet suburban rule dispute into something much bigger than an HOA meeting. The tow truck driver finally stepped out of his cab, boots scraping lightly against the asphalt as he approached the Jeep with the slow caution of someone who had learned that early morning calls in quiet neighborhoods often came with hidden complications. He looked at me first, then at Bethany, then down at the broken chain resting on the bumper. The diesel engine behind him continued to idle, low and steady, filling the air with that familiar oily smell that always reminds me of highway truck stops at sunrise. Bethany noticed his hesitation immediately and clapped her hands once in sharp impatience. "You can proceed," she said firmly, pointing toward the front of the Jeep. "The HOA has already approved the removal." The driver shifted his weight slightly, but did not move closer. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I just want to confirm the owner is aware." Bethany turned toward me with a tight smile that looked more like a challenge than a greeting. "He is aware now," she replied. A sprinkler system down the street clicked on with a rhythmic ticking sound, sending thin arcs of water across a perfectly trimmed lawn while the sun climbed higher above the rooftops. The quiet cul-de-sac had turned into a small audience. 2 neighbors now stood near their mailboxes pretending to check letters that had clearly not arrived yet. Someone else watched from behind a half-open garage door. Willowbrook Estates had always loved a good morning spectacle. Bethany straightened her shoulders and folded her arms again, settling into the posture of someone delivering a final ruling. You were given multiple opportunities to remove this vehicle voluntarily, she said to me, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who believed every rule in the binder favored her side. The HOA board voted unanimously last week that enforcement would proceed if the violation continued. I rested both hands on the hood of the Jeep, feeling the faint vibration of the cooling engine metal beneath my palms, even though it had not moved in days. You held a vote about my vehicle? I asked. Community enforcement requires proper procedure, she replied. Unlike some residents, we follow the rules. Her perfume floated faintly through the warm air again, something expensive and overly sweet that mixed strangely with the diesel exhaust drifting from the tow truck. The driver glanced at me once more, then toward the windshield where a small government-issued decal sat just above the inspection sticker. It was not large enough to draw attention unless someone was looking closely, but it was there. Bethany had clearly never bothered to read it. Ma'am, the driver said again, lowering his voice slightly. That looks like an agency tag. Bethany waved the bolt cutters dismissively, like a teacher brushing aside a student's excuse. People put stickers on vehicles all the time, she said. It does not change HOA policy. I watched the exchange quietly. For 2 months, I had listened to variations of that same sentence. HOA policy. HOA authority. HOA enforcement. Bethany spoke those words the way some people talk about state law, confident that repeating them enough times made them absolute. The reality was a little more complicated. The Jeep had arrived here with me the day I moved into the house, dust still clinging to the wheel wells from a long stretch of highway outside El Paso, where our task force had wrapped up a surveillance operation. Most people in the neighborhood assumed it was simply my personal vehicle. Bethany had taken one look at it and decided it was a problem she intended to solve. Since then, she had measured my driveway twice, photographed the Jeep from 3 different angles, and sent violation letters with increasing levels of official-sounding language. The 3rd envelope had arrived with bright red ink across the top, reading final notice. Bethany believed that notice meant the next step was towing. What she did not understand yet was that the small decal on the windshield was not decorative, the equipment inside the vehicle was not ordinary, and the Jeep she was about to have hauled away belonged to an organization that did not answer to homeowner association bylaws. The tow truck driver shifted again, clearly weighing whether this job was worth the trouble that was beginning to settle into the air like the thick Texas humidity. The diesel engine behind him continued its steady rumble, while the flashing amber lights painted slow circles across Bethany's perfectly clean driveway. Bethany, however, showed no hesitation at all. She took 2 steps forward and tapped the Jeep's hood again, harder this time, the metallic knock echoing lightly through the quiet street. You see, she said, turning toward the small group of neighbors who had now fully committed to watching. This is exactly the problem with letting standards slip. 1 violation turns into 10. Her voice carried the same tone people use when presenting a lesson to a classroom, patient but absolutely convinced they are right. I leaned back slightly against the Jeep, arms resting casually across the hood, while the warm morning sunlight crept higher along the windshield. What standard exactly does the Jeep violate? I asked. Bethany did not even need to think. She had clearly rehearsed the answer. Section 8.3 of the Willowbrook Estates Covenants, she said immediately. Prohibition of commercial or municipal vehicles parked in residential view without board approval. The words rolled off her tongue like a memorized speech. She pointed toward the windshield. That decal alone proves my point. The tow truck driver glanced at the small sticker again and frowned slightly. It was not flashy, just a simple agency seal printed in muted colors with a serial number beneath it. The kind of label that means absolutely nothing to someone who has never worked around government equipment. Bethany mistook his hesitation for agreement and nodded proudly. Exactly, she said. Municipal equipment. Not allowed. The driver scratched the back of his neck. Ma'am, sometimes those tags mean the vehicle is assigned to someone working a government job. Bethany gave a small laugh, the kind that carries more dismissal than humor. Everyone works a job, she replied. That does not mean they can park official vehicles wherever they like. Across the street, the man with the coffee mug had moved a few steps closer to his mailbox. Another garage door lifted halfway, revealing someone standing just inside the shadow watching quietly. The quiet cul-de-sac had turned into a morning briefing room for Bethany's version of neighborhood law enforcement. She gestured again toward the Jeep as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. If exceptions are allowed, then everyone will claim one, she said. And then we no longer have a community standard. I watched her for a moment before answering. Did you ever try reading the tag? I asked. Bethany's eyes narrowed slightly. It does not matter what it says, she replied. The vehicle is still a violation. I let my hand slide across the hood and tapped lightly near the windshield where the decal sat in plain view. Sometimes details matter, I said. The tow truck driver stepped a little closer now, curiosity getting the better of him. He leaned forward just enough to read the small lettering beneath the seal. His eyebrows lifted almost immediately. He looked back at Bethany, then at me, then back at the decal again as if confirming what he had just read. Bethany noticed the change in his expression and crossed her arms tighter. What? She demanded. The driver cleared his throat. Ma'am, this does not say municipal. Bethany frowned. Then what does it say? The driver straightened slowly and glanced once more at the Jeep before answering. It says Federal Task Force Vehicle. For the first time since she stepped onto my driveway that morning, Bethany Kensington Wright hesitated. For a brief second, the entire driveway went quiet except for the steady rumble of the tow truck engine and the soft hiss of sprinklers running somewhere down the street. Bethany's confident smile froze just slightly, the kind of pause that happens when someone hears something they were not expecting but refuses to believe it matters. She looked from the tow truck driver back to the Jeep, then at the small decal on the windshield as if seeing it for the first time. Federal? She repeated, the words sounding more annoyed than concerned. The driver nodded once, still standing beside the front tire. That is what the tag says. Bethany's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward a little, squinting at the glass. The morning sun reflected off the windshield, making the small seal difficult to read from where she stood. She waved her hand dismissively after a moment. Anyone can put a sticker on a vehicle, she said. People do it all the time. Her voice had regained that familiar tone of certainty, the same one she had used when quoting the HOA bylaws earlier. Across the street, the man with the coffee mug lowered it slowly, clearly enjoying the unfolding drama more than whatever morning news program he had originally planned to watch. Bethany straightened and looked back at the tow truck driver with a firm expression. Proceed with the tow, she said again. The driver hesitated longer this time. He glanced once more at the decal, then toward me, then back at Bethany. Ma'am, I just want to be careful, he said. If this vehicle is part of a federal assignment, moving it without authorization could cause problems. Bethany gave a short laugh that carried across the driveway. The only problem here is an HOA violation, she replied. And the HOA has full authority to enforce community standards. I rested one hand on the Jeep's hood again and watched the exchange quietly. Bethany had built her entire argument around one simple belief that morning, that the rules printed inside her thick binder of neighborhood covenants applied to everything inside Willowbrook Estates. To her, the street, the houses, the lawns, even. The vehicles parked in driveways all fell under the same authority. What she did not realize yet was that some equipment operates under an entirely different set of rules. The driver shifted his stance again and looked at me directly this time. Sir, he said carefully, is the vehicle active government equipment? I nodded once. Yes. Bethany's head snapped toward me. That is irrelevant, she said immediately. Community covenants apply to all residents equally. The tow truck driver rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. I just want to avoid hauling something that belongs to a federal task force, he said. Bethany crossed her arms again, the bolt cutters still hanging loosely from one hand. Then let me be perfectly clear, she replied. The Homeowner Association of Willowbrook Estates has voted to remove this vehicle. Her voice carried the confidence of someone used to getting the final word in neighborhood meetings. She gestured toward the Jeep once more. And I am the president of that association. I looked down briefly at the broken chain still lying on the bumper, the clean-cut edges glinting in the sunlight. Then I looked back up at Bethany. You might want to reconsider that decision, I said calmly. Bethany tilted her head slightly. Why would I do that? She asked. I nodded toward the chain. Because cutting a lock on a vehicle that belongs to a federal task force usually creates paperwork that your HOA board is not prepared to deal with. For the second time that morning, Bethany Kensington Wright hesitated, and this pause lasted just a little longer than the first. The silence that followed my words stretched across the driveway like a thin crack forming in glass. The tow truck engine continued to idle, its steady rumble now sounding much louder in the still morning air. Bethany's confident posture shifted just slightly, the bolt cutters lowering a few inches as her eyes moved from me to the Jeep and back again. She was clearly running through a new calculation in her head, trying to decide whether what I had just said was a bluff or a complication she had not planned for. The neighbors watching from their driveways leaned a little closer without pretending to check their mail anymore. Bethany Kensington Wright was not used to uncertainty, and everyone on this street knew it. She recovered quickly, however, drawing herself upright again as if the moment of hesitation had never happened. "You are exaggerating," she said sharply. "This is a homeowners association matter, not a federal issue." The words sounded firm, but there was a faint edge behind them now, like someone speaking a little louder than necessary to convince themselves. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, the glass screen catching a bright reflection of the morning sun. The motion alone made Bethany's eyes narrow again. "What exactly are you doing?" she demanded. "Just making a quick call," I replied calmly. The tow truck driver took 2 slow steps backward toward his truck, as if instinctively creating a little distance from whatever was about to happen next. The phone rang once before the line picked up. A familiar voice answered immediately. "Task Force Operations." "Good morning," I said. "This is Daniel Carter. I need to report a situation involving assigned vehicle number 427. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Is the vehicle compromised?" the voice asked. "Not exactly," I replied. "But someone just cut the security chain and attempted to have it towed from a private residence." Bethany's expression tightened the moment she heard the word attempted. Her eyes flicked toward the tow truck driver, who suddenly found the ground near his boots very interesting. The voice on the phone spoke again, this time slower. "Repeat that last part." "The chain was cut about 5 minutes ago," I said, glancing down briefly at the broken lock still sitting on the bumper. "Bolt cutters." Another short pause followed. I could almost hear the gears turning on the other end of the call. "Is the vehicle still on site?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said. "And the individual responsible is standing right in front of it." Bethany took a step closer, clearly trying to hear every word now. The confident HOA president who had marched into my driveway with bolt cutters only minutes earlier now looked less like a neighborhood authority figure and more like someone realizing they might have stepped into a situation far outside the reach of homeowner association bylaws. The voice on the phone spoke again, this time with a tone that carried a quiet level of seriousness. "Understood. Remain where you are. Do not move the vehicle. We will handle the situation." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Bethany stared at me for a long moment before speaking again. "Who exactly did you just call?" she asked. The tow truck driver had already climbed halfway back into his cab, clearly deciding that whatever came next was above his pay grade. I looked down once more at the cut chain on the bumper, then back up at Bethany Kensington Wright. "The people who actually own that Jeep," I said. The quiet that settled over the cul-de-sac after my call felt different from the earlier tension. Before, it had been the kind of silence that comes from neighborhood curiosity. Now it carried the heavier weight of people realizing something official had just been set in motion. The tow truck driver had fully climbed back into his seat, but had not turned the engine off. He sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes flicking between Bethany and me through the windshield. Bethany Kensington Wright stood in the center of my driveway with the bolt cutters hanging at her side, her confident posture slowly stiffening as the reality of the situation began to settle in. "This is unnecessary," she said finally, her voice sharper now, as if the entire thing could still be solved through sheer insistence. "You are turning a simple community violation into something dramatic." I rested my hand lightly on the Jeep's hood again and shrugged. "I did not cut the lock," I said. Across the street the man with the coffee mug had completely abandoned any attempt to appear casual. He leaned against his mailbox like someone watching the final inning of a baseball game. Another neighbor had stepped halfway out onto their lawn. Willowbrook Estates had likely never hosted anything this interesting before 8 in the morning. Bethany glanced toward them briefly, then back at me. Her voice dropped slightly, the confidence still there, but now edged with impatience. You should call whoever you just spoke to and explain that this is an HOA enforcement action, she said. We handle these matters internally. I looked down the quiet street for a moment. The sunlight had fully cleared the rooftops now, turning the windows of the houses into bright rectangles of reflection. Somewhere a lawn mower started in the distance. Life in the neighborhood was continuing as usual, even if this driveway had become the center of attention. They already understand the situation, I replied calmly. Bethany shook her head once. That is not how homeowner associations work, she said. The board has authority over vehicles parked within community property lines. The tow truck driver opened his door slightly, clearly preparing to leave the moment he felt permission to do so. He had probably towed hundreds of cars over the years, but this one had clearly moved into territory he did not want any part of. Bethany noticed him shifting and turned toward the truck. You are still under contract with the HOA, she called out. The vehicle has been officially marked for removal. The driver gave a slow shake of his head. Ma'am, he said carefully, I think I am going to wait a bit before touching anything. Bethany's jaw tightened. She turned back toward me, the bolt cutters finally slipping from her fingers and landing with a dull metallic clatter on the driveway. The sound echoed briefly between the houses. For the first time since she stepped onto my property that morning, she looked less like the president of a homeowners association and more like someone realizing she might have misjudged the scale of the situation. The quiet lasted another minute. Then, far down the street, a pair of engines could be heard approaching. Not loud, not aggressive, just the steady hum of two larger vehicles moving slowly through the neighborhood. The sound carried clearly through the calm morning air. The tow truck driver noticed it first. He leaned out of his cab and looked toward the entrance of the cul-de-sac. Bethany followed his gaze. Two dark sport utility vehicles turned onto the street one after the other, moving at a measured pace between the neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. Their tinted windows reflected the bright sky as they rolled closer. They did not have flashing lights or sirens. They did not need them. Something about the calm way they approached made the entire street fall silent again. The first vehicle slowed near the curb in front of my house. The second pulled in behind it. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Bethany Kensington Wright watched the scene unfold with an expression that was now unmistakably uncertain. The people who stepped out were not members of an HOA board. The doors of the two sport utility vehicles closed with quiet, solid thuds that carried across the cul-de-sac like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. Three people stepped onto the pavement, all dressed in plain clothes, but moving with the kind of calm coordination that comes from working together for a long time. The morning sun caught the dark lenses of their sunglasses as they walked up the street toward my driveway, their footsteps steady against the asphalt. The neighborhood had gone completely still. Even the lawn mower in the distance had stopped. Bethany Kensington Wright watched them approach with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression shifting between irritation and uncertainty. She clearly expected someone official to arrive eventually, but the quiet professionalism of the people walking toward her was not what she had imagined when she began cutting the lock 20 minutes earlier. The man in front stopped beside the Jeep and rested his hand briefly on the hood, feeling the metal like someone greeting an old colleague. He looked up at me and nodded once. Morning, Carter. Morning, I replied. His eyes moved down to the broken chain sitting on the bumper. He picked up one half of the cut lock and examined the clean metal edge before setting it back down again. The second agent circled slowly around the Jeep, glancing through the windows to confirm the equipment inside had not been disturbed. The third person remained near the curb, quietly observing the scene and the growing cluster of neighbors watching from their lawns and driveways. Bethany cleared her throat and stepped forward with the posture of someone determined to regain control of a conversation. Excuse me, she said, projecting her voice the same way she did during homeowner meetings. This is a private residential matter handled by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The first agent turned toward her slowly, removing his sunglasses as he did. His expression remained calm, almost polite. Ma'am, he said evenly, did you cut the lock on this vehicle? Bethany blinked once, clearly surprised by the directness of the question. The vehicle was in violation of community covenants, she replied. I was enforcing HOA policy. The agent glanced briefly at the bolt cutters lying on the driveway, then back at the broken chain on the bumper. So the answer is yes, he said. Bethany lifted her chin slightly. The Homeowners Association has the authority to remove unauthorized vehicles, she said firmly. The second agent had finished his quiet inspection and walked back around the Jeep, nodding once toward his colleague. Everything is intact, he said. The first agent gave a small nod in return, then turned his attention fully back to Bethany. Ma'am, he said calmly, this vehicle is assigned to a federal task force and contains specialized equipment used in active investigations. Bethany's confident posture faltered just slightly again. That may be true, she said quickly, but this is still a residential neighborhood with governing rules. The agent studied her for a moment before speaking again, his tone still calm, but carrying a new level of clarity. Homeowners associations regulate landscaping, parking guidelines, and property appearance, he said. They do not authorize residents to cut security locks on federal equipment. A faint ripple moved through the small crowd of neighbors watching from across the street. Bethany's gaze shifted toward them briefly before returning to the agent. I was protecting property values, she insisted. The agent nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. He gestured toward the Jeep and the broken chain resting on the bumper. Right now, he said, we are more interested in protecting federal property. Bethany Kensington Wright looked down at the bolt cutters on the driveway, as if seeing them for the first time. The quiet that followed the agent's words stretched across the cul-de-sac like the slow settling of dust after a storm. Bethany Kensington Wright stared down at the bolt cutters on the concrete, the bright orange handles suddenly looking much less like a tool of authority and more like a piece of evidence she wished had never left her garage. The agent who had been speaking let the silence sit for a moment, giving her time to process what had just been said. The tow truck driver shut off his engine, the diesel rumble fading away until the entire street was filled only with the distant chirping of birds and the soft ticking of a sprinkler head rotating somewhere behind a fence. The agent beside the Jeep lifted the broken chain again and examined the cut edge carefully before placing it back on the bumper. That is a clean cut, he said quietly, more to his colleague than anyone else. The first agent nodded slightly and then looked back at Bethany. His voice remained calm and measured, but the meaning behind it was unmistakably firm. Ma'am, interfering with federal equipment creates a situation that requires documentation and review, he said. Bethany's confident tone from earlier had completely disappeared. She glanced toward the neighbors gathered across the street, clearly aware that every word was being heard. I did not know the vehicle belonged to a federal unit, she said quickly. It looked like a personal car. The agent gave a small nod as if acknowledging the statement, but not letting it change the facts already sitting on the driveway. That is why most people ask questions before cutting locks, he replied. A faint ripple of quiet laughter moved through the watching neighbors before fading again just as quickly. Bethany drew in a slow breath and tried to recover the posture she had carried earlier that morning. The Homeowners Association has rules about vehicles, she said, though the sentence no longer carried the same force it once had. The agent glanced briefly toward the row of identical houses lining the street and then back at her. And federal task forces have rules about their equipment, he said. The second agent closed the Jeep's door after checking inside once more and nodded toward me. All systems look fine, he said. The first agent slipped his sunglasses back on and gestured toward the chain. We will note the damage and replace the security lock before the vehicle moves again, he said. Bethany watched them work with the quiet expression of someone realizing the entire situation had moved far beyond the reach of a homeowners association meeting. The tow truck driver climbed down from his cab and slowly began coiling his towing cable back into place, clearly relieved to have an excuse to leave the scene. I rested my hand on the Jeep's hood again and looked down the quiet street. The morning had returned to its normal rhythm. A garage door closed somewhere nearby. A car drove past the entrance of the neighborhood without slowing. Life was continuing exactly as it had before Bethany decided to enforce community standards with a pair of bolt cutters. The first agent finished writing a few notes on a small pad and then looked toward Bethany one last time. Next time you see a vehicle with a federal decal, he said calmly, it is usually a good idea to leave the lock alone. Bethany nodded slowly, her earlier confidence completely gone. The agents returned to their vehicles, doors closing quietly behind them. As the sport utility vehicles pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street, the small audience of neighbors slowly drifted back toward their homes. The broken chain still rested on the bumper for a moment longer until one of the agents replaced it with a new lock from the equipment kit. I watched Bethany pick up the bolt cutters and walk silently back toward her house. The cul-de-sac grew quiet again, and the Jeep remained exactly where it had been the night before, parked in the same driveway, under the same Texas sun, now surrounded by a neighborhood that suddenly seemed far less interested in enforcing parking rules.